Most people think fear is the problem. So they wait and wait for fear to disappear before they move. But fear is not the enemy. The real enemy is paralysis. That quiet habit of postponing action until life has already moved past you. Iqbal's insight is sharp. Fear doesn't stop your destiny. Your obedience to fear does. This episode explores Iqbal's vision of fear as a signal, not a prison. Fear appears at thresholds of growth. The self's choice is simple. Let fear advise, or let it command. Action shrinks imagined threats. Avoidance magnifies them. Courage, in this frame, is not the disappearance of fear, but loyalty to purpose while fear is present. The more the self acts with fear present, the more fear becomes information, not authority. Today, we continue our journey through Asrar Khudi, The Secret of the Self by Allama Iqbal. This is episode 27. In this reflection, we look at fear not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a threshold to be crossed. A test that reveals whether the self will obey sensation or remain faithful to its purpose. Take a calm breath. Notice your own fears for a moment. And as you listen, ask yourself, is fear advising me or secretly ruling me? Fear is not the enemy of the self. Paralysis is fear appears whenever growth approaches a threshold. At that threshold, the self must decide whether fear will advise or command. The self often waits for fear to disappear before acting. This waiting never ends, fear dissolves only after movement begins. The self that demands certainty before action surrenders agency to imagination. Imagination magnifies threat. Action reveals proportion. Fear shrinks when tested. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is obedience to purpose. Despite its presence, purpose clarifies direction. Direction reduces hesitation. The self that avoids discomfort to avoid fear trades growth for safety. Safety stagnates. Stagnation amplifies fear over time. Fear that is never faced acquires authority. Authority claimed by fear shrinks the self's world gradually. Shrunken worlds feel secure but suffocating. The self learns that fear predicts nothing. Prediction requires data. Fear invents outcomes. Action supplies feedback. Feedback corrects imagination. The self must stop treating fear as prophecy. Fear is sensation, not message. Interpreted as message, it misleads. Observed as sensation, it loses control. Courage grows from repeated exposure. Exposure normalizes sensation. Normalization reduces panic. Reduced panic enables learning. The self that confronts fear discovers competence. Competence builds confidence. Confidence reframes fear. Fear becomes signal, not barrier. The self does not need bravery in advance. Bravery appears once movement is underway. Waiting to feel brave is misunderstanding courage. Fear intensifies in isolation. Shared experience disperses it. The self that articulates fear reduces its grip. Silence magnifies threat internally. The self often fears judgment more than harm. Judgment attacks identity. Identity secured internally neutralizes this fear. The self that fears failure confuses outcome with worth. Worth precedes outcome. Outcome educates worth, not define it. Fear thrives on delay. Delay provides time for imagination to expand. Action interrupts expansion. Interruption restores proportion. The self that learns courage tolerates vulnerability. Vulnerability exposes uncertainty. Uncertainty fosters adaptation. Adaptation strengthens Khudi. Fear narrows perception. Narrow perception exaggerates risk. Action widens perception. Widened perception balances fear. The self learns that fear is physical. Breath regulates it. Posture regulates it. Motion regulates it. Stillness without awareness amplifies sensation. The self must practice courage in small acts. Small acts accumulate. Accumulation converts fear into familiarity. The self notices that courage fades when commitment is vague. Clear commitment fuels endurance. Endurance stabilizes response. Fear weakens when the self stops bargaining with avoidance. Avoidance feeds fear. Engagement starves it. The self understands that courage does not remove pain. It clarifies pain's meaning. Meaning converts pain into tolerable effort. The self that faces fear early pays less later. Deferred fear returns with compound interest. Early exposure reduces cost. The self realizes that fear is often anticipation. Anticipation rarely matches reality. Reality encountered corrects fantasy swiftly. The self stops asking, "How do I eliminate fear?" It asks, "How do I act responsibly with fear present?" The self discovers that fear respected becomes focus. Fear worshipped becomes tyrant. Fear ignored becomes blind spot. The self begins to see that courage reveals values. The chosen action under fear shows what matters most. What matters directs life. Direction stabilizes will. Fear accompanies thresholds. Thresholds signal expansion. Avoided thresholds shrink being. Cross thresholds redefine identity. The self develops bravery by moving while afraid. Movement trains nervous system. Trained systems obey intention, not impulse. The self recognizes that courage is cultivated, not summoned. Cultivation takes repetition. Repetition ingrains response. Response stabilizes character. Fear no longer feels mysterious. It feels mechanical. What becomes mechanical can be managed. Management restores dignity. The self begins to recognize that fear is intensified by imagination deprived of action. Imagination without movement fills gaps with catastrophe. Movement supplies reality. Reality corrects exaggeration. Fear persists, not because it is powerful, but because it is unanswered. Answering fear with action repositions authority. Authority returns to the self. The self learns that courage is a skill. Skills are trained. Training normalizes strain. Normalized strain becomes tolerance. The self that repeatedly faces fear acquires emotional range. Range increases options. Limited range creates fragility. Fragility invites avoidance. Fear thrives where identity is unstable. Stable identity absorbs shock. Shock absorbed educates. Education strengthens presence. The self realizes that courage requires clarity of intention. Foggy intention magnifies hesitation. Clear intention organizes response. Organization reduces fear's authority. The self stops demanding comfort before action. Comfort follows engagement, not preparation. Preparation alone does not reassure. Action reassures through feedback. The self sees that fear often protects ego, not life. Ego fears embarrassment. Life requires risk. Confusing the two shrinks existence. The self that fears judgment must examine whose judgment matters. Borrowed judgment controls behavior. Internal judgment frees it. Freedom dissolves fear of approval loss. Fear becomes manageable when the self accepts the possibility of failure. Failure acknowledged loses power. Denied failure terrorizes imagination. The self learns that courage deepens humility. Humility admits limitation. Limitation acknowledged prevents panic. Panic emerges when limits surprise. The self recognizes that courage is strengthened in motion. Motion regulates nervous response. Frozen posture invites anxiety. Embodied action restores balance. The self discovers that fear becomes specific. When examined, specific fear can be addressed. Vague fear cannot. Naming fear reduces its scope. The self that articulates fear clearly defangs it. Articulation turns sensation into information. Information improves judgment. The self observes that courage does not demand confidence. Confidence appears later. Courage builds confidence through exposure. Exposure trains trust in capability. The self learns that postponing fear only enlarges it. Unfaced fear collects imagination. Faced fear collects experience. Experience stabilizes response. The self that practices courage early and often loses fascination with comfort. Comfort becomes option, not necessity. Necessity enslaves. Option liberates. Fear narrows time perception. Everything feels urgent. Urgency shortcuts reflection. Courage slows response. Slowed response increases choice. The self realizes that fear is not personal. It is universal. Universal emotion managed skillfully. Strengthens solidarity with others. Isolation magnifies fear. The self that witnesses others act courageously inherits friction tolerance. Models reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty feeds fear. Exposure rearranges expectations. The self understands that courage grows when actions align with values. Value-aligned action stabilizes identity. Identity anchored internally reduces anxiety. Fear often signals proximity to meaning. Meaning demands commitment. Commitment triggers fear. Fear confirms importance. The self stops viewing fear as obstacle. It becomes indicator. Indicator points to growth edge. Growth edges redefine capacity. The self learns that courage requires patience with discomfort. Discomfort fades with occupancy. Occupancy retrains perception. Perception shifts behavior. The self that accepts discomfort without catastrophe thinking discovers resilience. Resilience changes relationship with fear. The self experiences that courage is cumulative. Each act lowers threshold for the next. Lower threshold increases engagement. Engagement fuels mastery. Fear diminishes when the self refrains from rehearsing disaster. Rehearsal strengthens imagery. Imagery drives physiological response. Interrupting rehearsal preserves calm. The self recognizes that courage restores authority over future. Authority reclaimed enables long-term planning. Planning dilutes fear's immediacy. The self becomes calm. Not because fear vanished, but because fear lost command. Command replaced by intention. The self learns that courage is sustaining, not consuming. Consuming fear drains life. Sustaining courage expands it. The self sees that courage is trainable across domains. Small acts reshape neural expectation. Expectation informs reaction. Reaction becomes habit. The self no longer avoids fear. It studies it. Study replaces myth. Myth empowers fear. Understanding dismantles it. There comes a moment when the self understands that fear was never meant to be eliminated. It was meant to be trained. An untrained fear dominates. A trained fear informs. The self recognizes that courage is not explosive. It is steady. Steadiness outlasts intensity. Intensity exhausts. Enduring courage reshapes identity. The self accepts that acting with fear present is a permanent condition of growth. Growth without discomfort is illusion. Discomfort aligned with purpose is education. The self realizes that courage reveals fidelity to values. Values untested are imagined. Values tested under fear become embodied. The self stops equating nervousness with danger. Nervous systems respond to novelty. Novelty does not equal threat. Exposure corrects this error. The self that cultivates courage does not seek conflict. It does not avoid it either. It responds proportionally. Proportion reflects maturity. Fear loses authority when the self refuses to make it special. Routine exposure trivializes sensation. What becomes ordinary loses its power. The self learns that courage simplifies decision-making. When values are clear, fear complicates nothing. Clarity dissolves hesitation. The self understands that thinking cannot defeat fear. Action recalibrates biology. Biology trains attention. Attention supports intention. The self sees that courage generates momentum. Momentum rewards persistence. Persistence broadens capability. Capability nourishes confidence. The self that keeps acting despite internal resistance proves reliability to itself. Self-trust replaces anxiety. Anxiety fades. The self realizes that courage sustains honesty. Fear invites compromise. Courage resists distortion. Distortion avoided preserves integrity. The self no longer dramatizes fear. Drama intensifies sensation. Neutral observation reduces it. Observation restores agency. The self accepts that courage deepens empathy. Those who face fear recognize vulnerability in others. Recognition softens isolation. Connection stabilizes presence. The self realizes that courage stabilizes under repetition. First responses are unsteady. Repeated exposure smooths action. Smooth action signals mastery. The self learns that courage is ethical strength. Ethics without courage collapse under pressure. Courage without ethics destabilizes power. Their union creates responsibility. The self becomes comfortable. Acting without guarantees. Guarantees freeze initiative. Initiative creates opportunity. Opportunity evolves destiny. The self understands that fear trained becomes vigilance. Vigilance sharpens awareness. Awareness improves choice. The self stops asking whether courage will be rewarded. Reward thinking corrupts courage. Courage justified by alignment endures, regardless of outcome. The self recognizes that courage rebuilds time. Time spent avoiding fear contracts life. Time spent confronting fear expands it. The self no longer fears the feeling of fear. Fear felt openly loses sting. Sting depends on resistance. Acceptance dissolves escalation. The self sees that courage is quiet commitment to continue acting without certainty. Certainty arrives after action, if at all. The self ends rivalry with fear. Fear becomes instrument. Instrument tuned produces music. Untuned fear produces noise. The self concludes that courage is learned obedience to purpose over sensation. Sensation fluctuates. Purpose persists. The self now moves forward with presence under pressure. Pressure no longer dictates outcome. Responsiveness replaces impulsivity. Responsiveness is mastery. The self understands at last. Fear arrived to test readiness. Courage developed to confirm it. And the self, having learned to act without certainty, now grows freely into its next form.